Almost every kind of suffering is made much worse by isolation. And almost every kind of suffering is alleviated to some extent by human connection. A lot of Americans find it difficult to think about the subject of war veterans, so I especially want to thank you for watching this. There are so many problems that go on for decades after veterans come home from wars. I've interviewed veterans from World War II to the current wars, and they all tell me pretty much the same things. Whether their war was a so-called good war or a bad war, depending on, it doesn't matter how they feel about it, doesn't matter how the country felt about it, there are some things that veterans have in common, which is that they've had experiences that are so deeply disturbing, so horrific, so confusing, so grief-inspiring, that really most of us have never had experiences like that. So the problem is that so many of them keep all this inside. They are isolated from the rest of the citizens of this country. From the veterans' points of view, they're afraid of three things. One is that if they tell us what they've been through at war and then since they've been home, they're afraid it will upset us as much as it's upset them, and they don't want to burden us. A second reason is that they are understandably afraid, what if I tell the story and the other person just doesn't understand because they weren't there? And the third reason is they live with so much anxiety and so many flashbacks and images. They're haunted by so many things that they saw or that they went through. And they often think, they look around them, and if other vets aren't talking either, they think they're the only one who's still upset, who's having moral conflicts, or a whole variety of painful feelings. So they often think that they are mentally ill. They'll say, I guess I'm crazy because lots of military people have gotten over it, but I haven't. Now let me say a bit about what keeps civilians very often from asking vets if they want to tell their story. We live in a culture that is increasingly what I call psychiatrized. And by that I mean that just about everything gets called a mental illness. And one of the results of that is, probably you've heard people say things like, oh, her boyfriend dumped her and she was just devastated, but I didn't talk to her because I'm not a therapist. In other words, in this country, we increasingly feel that if anybody is having any kinds of upset feelings, then only a therapist can fix them. And also what often goes along with that is the wrong assumption that therapists can fix everything. Well, I can tell you, as a therapist myself, therapists don't learn how to fix the emotional carnage of war. A lot more is needed. We are not trained to deal with the terrible moral conflicts that many soldiers have, and many of them have these conflicts regardless of how they feel about the war that they were in. As one veteran from the Iraq War told me, he was very pro-war, he felt that it had been important for him to be there, but he said that every night he hears a woman's screams. And this was a woman that they had been told was carrying dynamite and was going to try to blow them up. And he shot and killed her. And they found out that indeed she had been carrying dynamite and she was going to try to blow them up. And I said to him, and still you are haunted by her screams every night. And this big, strong guy looked at me and said, I wasn't raised to kill. So what often happens then is that civilians who are not therapists think, I have a feeling that the war experiences must have been horrible and that I'm just not qualified, I'm not equipped to do what the vet needs. They'll get upset and I won't know what to do. It would be the right thing, and so it's not my place to try. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's something we used to call friendship. It's something we used to call human connection. So I don't want any civilians out there to think that there's nothing that you could do. And we'll come back to that in a moment. In fact, the top brass in the military and in the Veterans Affairs right now have publicly expressed concern, and they've said, we have brought in so many programs, therapy of all kinds, individual and group and family and various techniques, and you know what? The rates of homelessness keep going up. The rates of suicide keep going up. The rates of imprisonment because of violence. The rates of substance abuse and of family breakdown. So even if everybody who's been treating veterans so far in the traditional ways were doing a terrific job, the fact is there are still hundreds of thousands of veterans who continue to suffer terribly. In the Civil War, people who were soldiers and who were traumatized were described as having soldier's heart. I think that's a very moving expression. And listen to the presence of war in the word soldier. During World War I and then World War II, there were other names, but the presence of war as the devastating factor was very clear in each case. So whether they called it shell shock, battle fatigue, combat fatigue, war trauma, it was very clear. It's war that led to these terrible feelings and this horrible upset. Then after the Vietnam War, some very well-meaning people got together and they said, you know what? A lot of the Vietnam vets are suffering horribly, and people are not paying attention, they're not taking it seriously. And they said, we think we know what needs to be done. Let's create a category called post-traumatic stress disorder. And let's try to get it in the psychiatric manual of diagnosis. It's what people call the psychiatrist's Bible, and psychologists use it as well. And they meant well. They were trying to say, pay attention, people are suffering. And it did have that effect to some extent. The problem is that the psychiatric handbook is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So you have this very troubling paradox, which is that on the one hand, to be devastated by war is, of course, a human, understandable response. And if we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, we are saying it's a mental illness. And I'd like you to think about this. If being devastated by war is a mental illness, then what would be a healthy response to war? Remember those words that were used earlier, in earlier wars. Post-traumatic stress disorder. There's no word connected with war in there except trauma. And you know what? Any veteran will tell you that the trauma of being at war is different from the trauma of being hit by a bus or being in a tornado or being viciously attacked by somebody at a party. So we make war as the cause, the very particular cause of veteran suffering. We make it invisible. It takes us just one step back from what they've really been through, and that's the last thing they need.